For painting the rose, I used a specific set of colors: titanium white, cadmium red deep, alizarin crimson, transparent oxide red, burnt umber, ultramarine blue, green and light blue mixture of ultramarine violet and white. Before my brush even hits the canvas, I spend approximately 20 minutes just on pre-mixing the colors. This step is crucial because it lays the foundation for the entire piece. During this phase, I decide the dominant color my rose will carry, a decision I commit to as I continue mixing and painting later on. To give myself options, I mix multiple shades. I almost always start with what's known as the local color, which for this painting is a cool pink shade. But I don't stop there. I also whip up a cooler mix, especially for the areas that are partially in halftone and tilted toward a cooler light source. This ensures that the painting captures the nuances of light and shadow accurately. In preparation, I also concoct a few blends for the darker, more shadowy areas. These shades are inherently warmer and have a reddish tint, differing from the local color. This variety allows me to layer my work, giving it a richer texture and greater depth. Despite this level of preparation, the painting remains a fluid process. As I go along, I find myself continually adjusting the mixes, enhancing their saturation, shifting their value, and even altering their temperature to better suit the composition's evolving needs. This dynamic approach keeps me engaged and ensures that the final piece is a harmonious blend of meticulous planning and spontaneous artistic expression. Every part of my painting's got a specific value that's already been laid down in the gray underpainting. So when I'm layering on color, it's basically reiterating what's been done before, at least when it comes to value. I'm always vigilant about making sure the hue I'm slapping on there lines up with the value of that gray base. Put simply, the mixed color I'm laying down is either as dark or the exact same level of dark as the original undercoat. To effectively implement this approach, it's essential to have a solid understanding of how to gauge values, much like when you're shading a sketch with charcoal. Most artists use a simple trick to aid in this: they squint while looking at an object. By doing this, fine details blur into a more uniform visual field, eliminating distractions and making it much easier to estimate the value of the area you're focusing on with greater accuracy. But we're not limited to traditional methods. We're living in the 21st century after all. For those who wish to employ more technologically advanced techniques, there's an even more precise way to gauge values: the smartphone. Simply switch the camera to black and white mode and observe your work through the screen. This makes it remarkably easy to discern the varying degrees of lightness or darkness in your color values. While some artists opt for other tools like reducing glasses fitted with monochrome filters, I personally find using a smartphone to be more straightforward and accurate. When I begin with my first layer of color, I'm careful not to go heavy on the paint application. This is a strategic decision, because the mass and texture that I'm aiming for have already been established in my gray underpainting, serving one of its primary functions. As I've previously mentioned, the principle I follow for applying this initial layer of color is directly influenced by the tonal values present in the underlying layer. In practical terms, what this means is that I apply the paint about half a tone lighter on the brighter areas than I do with the gray underpainting. Conversely, in the shadow areas, I opt for a hue that's a notch darker than the tonal value of the gray underpainting. This approach allows me to gradually stretch out the value scale, expanding it beyond the slightly compressed range that existed in the gray layer. I plan to continue with this methodology in the subsequent color layers, but I'll elaborate on that in the future. The ultimate objective for this initial color layer is to accurately capture the local color of the subject I'm painting. For the shadowed areas, the colors I choose are intentionally darker and more transparent than the colors used for areas exposed to more light. I followed the same methodology when I created the gray underpainting. The end result is that in the shadow areas, you'll observe warmer undertones shining through from the imprimatura layer, enriching and warming the cooler shadowed parts of the rose. To maintain this aesthetic and functional balance, it's crucial that I continue to apply the paint thinly in the shadowed areas. This ensures that the warm undertones, so essential to the composition, are not lost in the process. When I'm deeply involved in the creative process of oil painting, one of the key things I have to be conscious of is the impact of a gray underpainting. The use of gray as an undercoat isn't arbitrary. It cools down the color that you subsequently apply, as well as diminishes its saturation. This cooling and desaturation effect is particularly prominent in the halftone areas when I lay down the second layer of color, which comes after allowing ample time for the first layer to dry completely. After the drying process, the first layer of color gains a certain translucency. The gray underpainting that lies beneath it comes into play here, reducing the color saturation even more significantly. When I mix my palette, this understanding drives me to ensure that my chosen shades are adequately rich and vibrant. It's not something that you get right immediately. It demands a good amount of practical experience and know-how in the art of color mixing. Another intriguing aspect is the optical illusion that a gray base creates. Because of the contrast between the gray undercoat and the colors, your hues on the canvas can seem far more vivid and lively than they really are. It's a psychological effect that also extends to the perceived temperature of your color mixes. If you're painting on a cooler gray undercoat, for example, the colors you use might appear warmer in relation to that backdrop. Understanding these nuances is crucial, and it's why I make calculated decisions when I'm mixing colors. It sounds simpler than it is, so I highly recommend that anyone serious about mastering this should test it out for themselves. It's through this experimentation that I've been able to develop my own tailored system of painting that meets my unique artistic needs. After creating a series of paintings with this approach, you too will find a method that clicks with your artistic sensibilities. When I lay down the first layer of paint in my multi-layered artwork, I'm intentionally keeping things a little subdued in the color department. I find that less is more at this stage. There's a reason for this. I like to keep the temperature differences, cool blues and warm reds, as well as the color contrasts between different shades somewhat muted. The reason behind this is the visible gray underpainting that serves as my canvas's foundational layer. It sets the tone and helps me better manage my subsequent layers. As I progress through my piece, it's like I'm conducting an orchestra of hues and tones. I gradually work on extending the range of values, which means making the darks darker and the lights lighter. But I also invest a good deal of time in enhancing the color spectrum and increasing its richness and complexity as I apply new layers. My aim is that each additional layer should be more colorful and should pop with increased contrast. So the concept of layering for me is an evolutionary process. It's a cycle of maximizing every element, be it contrast, temperature or color saturation, up to the fullest extent that the canvas allows. During this crucial first layer, my mental energy is heavily focused on shaping the forms. I'm not yet considering the light play or the textures that will add life to my painting. Those come later, as I build up the paint and start to work with those complexities. So, think of the first color pass as the prelude to a symphony, the second color pass, where everything comes to life, where the rose on my canvas blooms in all its glory. While I'm painting, I'll talk more about the colors of flowers and how light affects their appearance. When it comes to capturing the colors and beauty of flowers, nothing beats Mother Nature's natural lighting. Flowers and roses are meant to grow outdoors, and their natural beauty stands out, especially on a bright sunny day. The infinite color nuances that are visible in nature are best captured under this kind of natural lighting. It's truly breathtaking to see the subtle variations in color and hue that exist in a single flower. So if you want to capture the true beauty of a flower in your artwork, natural lighting is the way to go. Alright, so how do you go about modeling flowers lit by natural light? To really understand how to do this, you need to have a solid grasp of what bright daylight consists of. A bright sunny day is essentially made up of three light sources: the sun itself, the blue sky, and reflected light from illuminated objects. The sun, as the warm yellow-orange primary light source, is surrounded by a cold, diffuse illumination from the blue sky. This secondary light source hits the subject from various directions, especially at higher altitudes where the air is clear. The sky at these altitudes has a more blue-violet tint and produces darker, cooler shadows. The more clouds there are in the sky, the grayer the blue will appear. So if you're trying to model a scene or subject that's lit by this kind of natural light, you need to take all three light sources into account to create a convincing three-dimensional object. And don't forget, these changes in temperature and color must also be reflected in the subject itself. In addition to the primary light source, there are also secondary light sources to consider. Reflected light from nearby surfaces, for instance, can bounce back onto the subject and affect its overall appearance. In a garden setting, for example, the green foliage and grass around the flowers will reflect green light back onto them, which can subtly alter their color and tone. As a 3D modeler, it's important to take all these factors into account when creating a realistic representation of a flower or any other natural subject. By paying attention to the color, quality, and direction of the light, you can create a sense of depth and dimensionality that brings your model to life. And by reflecting the temperature changes of the light in the subject itself, you can create a sense of harmony and balance that makes the final product truly convincing. When I'm sculpting flowers in my artwork, I always keep in mind that I'm dealing with a translucent three-dimensional object. It's crucial for me to remember that I'm not merely dealing with a flat two-dimensional representation, but rather a complex three-dimensional form. Unlike completely opaque materials, rose petals possess a certain level of translucency. This means that they allow some light to pass through them, especially depending on how they're oriented in relation to the source of light. This translucency creates an interesting phenomenon known as subsurface scattering, which in turn gives the shadows inside the flower a richer, more vivid look. Now, the passage of light through this translucent material works in a fascinating way. It actually increases both the value and saturation of the colors in the shadowed areas. You won't find this happening with matte or opaque subjects where light fails to penetrate. Shadows in these non-translucent objects are generally less vivid, less saturated. And in areas where the petals overlap or press tightly against one another, the access of light is restricted. Here, the shading principles that apply to opaque materials come into play, at least to some extent. So, all in all, the whole flower is a fascinating tapestry of translucent and opaque surfaces. It's this complexity that I need to consider carefully when determining the value and saturation of the colors as I engage in the careful process of mixing my paint palette. In my approach to painting, I pay special attention to the subtleties of light and shadow. I take care to not make the shadowy parts of the flower excessively dark, because even in natural settings the darkest areas of shadow tend to be at the flower's bottom. This consideration helps me create a more realistic portrayal, capturing the nuances of how light interacts with the flower from top to bottom.